Welcome to the Economy Magazine. I'm Binyamin Tjong-Alvares with the news from the global economy. Coming up, climate change comes at a high price for California. And Syria's proud Arak industry makes way for forgeries. First, the headlines. Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras denied seeking Russian cash as he headed to Moscow on Wednesday for Kremlin talks. Athens reportedly only has enough funds to last it until April 20th, leaving the Greek economy at risk of slipping back towards recession. Greece is running out of time to secure a 4-month extension from its creditors, and the new reform package falls short of their demands. A junior minister told Parliament Germany owes Greece more than $306 billion in war payments, including a $10 billion forced loan taken by Nazi occupation forces. But the dispute has effectively reached a judicial stalemate, given a related adjudication between Germany and Italy by the International Court of Justice in 2012.
When Germany asks us to be okay with our obligations to obey the laws and the treaties, they must also obey the laws. They don't, and they don't do it for an issue involving a crime against humanity, when there's a final decision from the Supreme Court.
Hong Kong stocks jumped to a 7-year high on Wednesday, driven by an explosive rally in Shanghai and a flood of cash from China. The benchmark Hang Seng Index, that is made up of mostly Chinese-focused stocks, rose 2.7%, taking gains over the past month to 7.4%. Hong Kong stocks benefited from a hiatus, during which investors piled into Shanghai, making shares of the same companies traded in Hong Kong cheaper. Hong Kong-listed stocks are trading at an average discount of 29.3% to equivalent shares trading in Shanghai, according to the Hang Seng China AH Premium Index. Moldovan farmers are starting to feel the backlash of Chisinau's decision to sign key trade and political agreements with the European Union. The country's biggest trading partner, Russia, swiftly punished it through an embargo strangling the Moldovan farm and wine industries. Russia's move has cost an estimated $145 million in losses for Moldova, the poorest country in Europe, which still relies largely on agriculture. And while the ex-Soviet state seeks EU membership, it will first have to find how $1 billion, about 15% of its GDP, vanished ahead of elections in November last year.
The biggest risk is if a part of those transferred amounts abroad are not taken back. This would mean that it will have to be supported by the budget of Moldova, which would affect every citizen.
Argentina's central bank sent regulators to Citibank Argentina's headquarters, saying they violated local laws by striking a deal with the holdout hedge funds. The bank suspended Citibank Argentina from conducting capital market operations and stripped authority from its chief executive. Citibank Argentina had agreed with the hedge funds not to appeal a U.S. court ruling that outlaws the processing of interest payments on restructured bonds. Citibank is the country's 12th largest by deposits, holding 2.6% of all deposits, or $2.67 billion.
Citibank, like Argentina, has its own responsibilities for having accepted the rules of the game and Argentina's laws and regulations to fulfill its duties as bond custodians.
Kenya's tourism industry braces for more misery following the Islamist gun attack which killed 148 people at a university campus in Garissa. Hoteliers from Kenya's coastal region said tourists have started canceling trips following the attack. Kenya's tourism industry has been in decline since 2013, when Al-Shabaab stormed an upscale shopping mall, killing 67 people. To cope with the drop in tourism, hotels have resorted to pay cuts of between 20 and 30%, and even as much as 50%.
For us to survive in that, many hotels, one have sent staff on unpaid leave. Some are actually laying off people. Others are retrenching, and some are actually taking pay cut.
A new report on climate change expects rising temperatures, droughts, and rising sea levels to worsen in California. And as the severe conditions carry high costs, I-24 News journalist Shelby Weiner reports on the consequences for the economy.
California suffers for the fourth consecutive year a dry spell. The state governor, Jerry Brown, announced in March the release of $1 billion to fund emergency measures, including streamlining water. Scientists expect the situation to worsen in the coming years. These are the findings of a new report on the consequences of climate change.
We find California emerging into a regime in which essentially every year is severely warm.
We're looking at, up to $10 billion of the current property being underwater by mid-century, an additional $10 billion at high tide.
Rising sea levels will have a direct impact on highly populated coasts of California, along with rising temperatures that would continue to dry up the remaining land. The climate is becoming similar to that of Texas today, which is a disaster for a highly agricultural area.
Are we going to see 2 degrees of global warming? Are we going to see 4 degrees of global warming? Are we going to see 6 degrees of global warming? The decisions that are made now will influence that trajectory, and that will influence the magnitude of impacts in California.
Scientists want a change in environmental policy and are calling for green energy to become a priority in order to limit CO2 emissions. They warn that making compromises could have serious counterproductive impact on the future of the economy.
So we really urge business makers and investors, and particularly long-term investors like the bond markets, to be out there actively on these issues, which actually are at their bottom line.
The report argues that rising temperatures may also cause a decline in labor productivity, drive up energy costs, worsen air pollution, and pose serious risk to the health of Californians.
As Syria's war rages on, one of the economic casualties is the Arak industry. With a shrinking customer base and severed supply routes, a glut of cheap counterfeits have slowly moved in on what was once a source of national pride.
Just add water, and it's instantly recognizable by its milky white color. Arak is a common sight on restaurant tables throughout Syria and the Levant. But this once successful liquor business has struggled in recent years, as cheap knockoffs have flooded the market.
No matter how much Arak we drink, even if we don't stop drinking the entire night, it doesn't make us drunk. Actually, it helps us enjoy our time even more. But fake Arak has a bad effect. It can completely spoil an evening.
Authentic Arak is made from fermented grapes flavored with aniseed. But as 4 years of conflict have hit Syrians' pockets hard, what was once a staple product has now become a luxury. And counterfeit bottles containing pure alcohol and an aniseed substitute have proliferated. Al-Mimas is one of 2 state-run Arak firms that once used to share 85% of the market. Now they account for less than half of it.
We used to produce 7,000 bottles a day. But since the war started, we only produce between 1,000 and 1,500 bottles a day.
Al-Mimas' profits have been cut in half since the start of the war. The sharp devaluation of the Syrian currency, severed supply routes, and a ban on alcohol in areas controlled by Islamists have all taken their toll. And where demand still exists, they have to compete with counterfeit bottles or new, cheaper brands, which sell for half the price.
I buy directly from the factory or from its exclusive agent only because I don't trust anyone else. I've received plenty of offers to trade with fake Arak, which would help me double my profits, but I don't want any of that in my shop. My customers trust me, and I don't want them to say I sell fake Arak.
In an effort to revive the industry, the government dropped its tax on Arak from 35% to 20% per bottle. But with the UN saying that 4 out of 5 Syrians now live in poverty, Arak is a luxury many can no longer afford.
The Great Recession has had far-reaching implications for interconnected markets worldwide. The media has greatly emphasized the macro implications of tools such as quantitative easing used by central banks to control the financial chaos. But in discussing the successes and failures of economic measures applied, the repercussions for the people are rarely considered. With us today to help us understand the big picture is Dr. Eli Cook, North American history expert and author of The Pricing of Progress, Economic Indicators and the Growth of American Capitalism. Dr. Cook.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so an interesting topic of discussion has always been, for me at least in the past couple of years, how since the Great Recession, we see a decline in the economic welfare of people. Some people say the baby boomers were the last generation to really enjoy prosperity. Is this the end of the American dream?
It might be, although the dream has been kind of lost before and it came back. So we can never say never. But actually, it's not the Great Recession. It really, the beginning of all this starts in the 70s and the 80s. That's when we see, you know, these graphs of inequality that everyone's showing us now. That's when they really begin to take off again.
Everyone meeting like Thomas Piketty, people
exactly.
like that?
So Thomas Piketty's book, The Real Turning Point, you can really see it. It's striking. It's somewhere around when Reagan gets elected. And of course, that's not a coincidence. You know, along with the financial deregulation and the union rate, for instance, dropped from 36% in the 1950s to about 10%. Or just look at CEO pay, for instance. In the 1960s, a CEO would earn probably 20 times more than his average worker. Now it's 250 times more.
Right.
So wherever you look across the board, at whatever graph you look at, it's really the 80s that kind of became the turning point, and really the 90s and then 2000s is just more of a continuation of that. And in many ways, the Great Recession was just kind of the economy's response to that. So basically, at the bottom. The bottom line is there were people who couldn't pay back their mortgages, right? There were people who were working oftentimes, but they were underwater because they...
What would you say? I mean, you're obviously coming in here with a lot of analysis, looking in not just the Great Recession, not just the past couple of years, but going back 20, 30 years, looking at all the different things that actually came to influence the situation. What would you say is the main issue, from your perspective, with modern economic thought?
Well, that's interesting. So you mentioned Thomas Piketty, and you're glad you did, because for years people didn't focus on economic distribution. So they would look at the side of the pie, and all these economic models would focus on how big the pie is and how much the economy is growing, and this is where GDP comes from, and all these metrics we hear, and just think, you know, on the nightly news, what do you usually hear, right? You hear the Dow Jones Industrial Average, you hear maybe economic growth, maybe unemployment, which I can talk about, but you hear, I don't know, the Gini coefficient, that's the measure of inequality, went up 3 points yesterday. No, we don't hear that. And studies, by the way, have shown that Americans think that their society is far more equal than it is because of that, because you don't hear that. But what's interesting now is the discussion is shifting in that regard. But I would say definitely the biggest issue has been that people have been focused so much on maximizing the productivity, maximizing the growth, that they haven't looked at compensation. So they'll talk about productivity, but they won't look at where the money's going.
Yeah, because essentially the media, you know, us included perhaps, have created a picture where we look at, oh, look at how great America is doing, right? But, you know, what is the meaning today then of capitalism? I mean, we all call ourselves capitalists, and we're all happy to be the way we are, and we can buy what we want, and, you know, can amass wealth. But what is the meaning of it today when we see, you know, the inequality just skyrocketing?
That's a great question. I think capitalism is in crisis, and I don't know where the solutions are going to come from. If you look at the United States, the American dream, the idea of social mobility, America's social mobility rates are some of the lowest in the world, in Western world. And this has to do with rising education costs, you know, makes it more expensive to go to university, but all sorts of different things. And just the inequality itself is really staggering. So just to give you an example, the top 10% of American earners, they earn probably about 50% of the income. They actually own 72% of the wealth. The bottom 50%, that's 150 million people, even more, they own 2% of the wealth. So, you know, the gap is growing and growing. And when people talk about social mobility, it's not just about climbing the ladder, but the rungs between the ladder are getting bigger. So it's harder to make that climb. So it's
no, still, I mean, you know, people are still essentially happy that they can go to wherever they go, Costco or, you know, Walmart, and you can relatively cheaply buy decent stuff, at least in America. You know, this is not true for all places in the world. But, you know, as I mentioned, Costco, Walmart, you talk about different companies, different supermarket chains, and you come to countries like Israel, you see even more so. There are certain monopolies, there are certain groups of companies that really control the industry. What is the issue there?
Well, so Israel's kind of going through its kind of moment of corporate capitalism, but it's important to remember that America didn't usually solve its questions of giant corporations with like tremendous competition or very low concentration. You mentioned Walmart. Walmart is a monster. It's enormous. It kind of controls huge swaths of the American economy. So the American solution has often been, though, what you said, and that is we're not going to pay people very high wages, but we are going to make sure that consumer goods are very, very cheap.
Exactly.
And there is a bonus to that. People feel as if they can maybe get that new iPhone, but if you, for instance, look at at Walmart workers, a lot of them are on welfare. In other words, they don't make enough money. This is what we call the working poor. And again, if we get back to my issue on unemployment, the American economy and American media is very good at talking about unemployment. What about the working poor, people who work 1, 2 jobs and still can't make ends meet?
Essentially the modern day sweatshops, or the Western sweatshops, if you want.
Yeah, although I think it's an important point that these aren't sweatshops, right? So it's hard work working at Walmart, but it's nothing like it was, 150, I'm an historian of like textile manufacturing in 150 years ago, and their work, it was different. But on the other hand, yes, there are some huge issues here as far as concerned of just enormous wealth disparities.
In the final comment, where do you see all of this going?
Historians never like to be kind of people who trying to predict where it's going, but I'll mention Piketty for my final statement. There's always been this idea that capitalism is cyclical, that, there are going to be the highs and there are going to be lows. Piketty doesn't think there's going to be a comeback. He just thinks this is how it's going to be. This is going to be the new normal. We're going to have very, very high inequality that's going to challenge democracy.
Okay, well, Dr. Eli Cook, North American expert, thanks for joining us, giving us more clarity about the situation we're dealing with today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, well, that's the Economy Show for today. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Binyamin Tjong-Alvares. Watch us on Twitter as well. And join us again tomorrow for more on the economy.